Now, let's turn our attention to the other side of the channel, should we? Because if you're a tourist and you're thinking about going to France, well, you're being warned against it as riots grip the country.
Yes, there's been violence and looting, and that's continued now for a fourth night across the country after the teenager that we've all heard about was fatally shot by police at a traffic stop.
Well, large events have been cancelled, so we're told. Some curfews are in force. There could be more put in force over the weekend, and buses and trams suspended nationwide.
Well, let's now talk to French-Algerian journalist and author Nabila Ramdani, who joins us now from Paris. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
It must be heartbreaking at the moment for you, living in Paris, which such a beautiful city, with such huge problems, actually not just in Paris, but all over the country. Is it a terrible atmosphere at the moment?
Yes, absolutely, and you're absolutely spot on. You know, the city of light, love and laughter is anything but at the moment. And as you mentioned, there was, again, huge rioting overnight and in all cities across France, despite curfews being imposed from 9 p.m. The Interior Minister is updating the figures all the time. And but the latest is almost 1,000 arrests last night alone. And an interesting statistic is that of the arrests so far since Tuesday night, the average age of those arrested is between 17 and 19. So these are very youthful riots, and it's almost a youthful way for French citizens who are rebelling against the system. And I have to say that a lot of the rioters have the same profile as NAHEL MERZOUK'S. They have an African background and they complain about persistent discrimination and indeed about police violence. But one thing that is very worrying is that criminals are getting involved in the riots. They're involved in acts of looting. There was a huge amount of looting happening overnight in big cities like Paris and Marseille. And yes, they were chanting justice for Nahel, but beyond that, there were gangs of criminals involved. And there is no doubt that there's a lot of anger in France about what's happened to Nahel. But as you know, France is a protest nation. It was built on revolutions. I mean, the big defining one, 1789, comes to mind. But this tradition carried on through violent protests, including the Yellow Vests one and the more recent pension reform protests, for example, with elements determined to cause a huge amount of damage. So it's quite right that people should be on the street and expressing their anger, but the kind of criminality that we're seeing playing out as well is clearly something that is inflaming the situation. But I'll tell you something else that is also inflaming the situation and that is not helpful is when you have a police union describing the rioters as hordes of savages and indeed vermin. Now, this is just a kind of inflammatory and, dare I say, colonial language that sums up the divide in France at the moment between a reactionary establishment backed up by a hugely powerful security state, including many paramilitaries, and lots of people from ethnic minority backgrounds who feels as though they are discriminated against in every aspect of their lives and who are not given opportunities and who are being treated like second-class citizens.
So Nabila, how much of this is about a lack of integration? Now, whether you, depending on which side you see that from, but a lack of integration of what is very large swathes of sort of migrant communities within France, not feeling as though they are, in effect, part of the system?
Yes, absolutely. There's a huge, very large section of the population that feels as though they are still treated like colonial subjects. Now, of course, Nahel is from an Algerian background, and this has exposed the treatment of similar French citizens by the French state. There have been tensions between Algerian communities and the French police going right back to the days when Algeria was a French colony. Algeria won a very savage war of independence, which ended in 1962. But this has caused huge anger and grievance among millions of French nationalists who wanted to hang on to Algeria. And dare I say, the city of Nanterre has particular historical resonance because it was the site of the biggest shanty towns in France in the 1950s and in the 1960s. which was filled with up to 10,000 migrant workers from mainly Algeria, and who were literally parked there with no running water or electricity. And most of the men who lived there were viewed by the French state as the enemy within. They were branded insurgents, they were subjected to extrajudicial killing and wounding. And this has characterized the way, the reputation, sealed, dare I say, the reputation of a notoriously barbaric police force. And this has reached a low point in October 1961, when up to 300 Algerians were murdered in central Paris. Many of them were thrown off bridges and were left to drown in the River Seine. So times has moved on, of course, but these shanty towns have developed into the council estates that we see today. And the descendants of these migrant workers now live there. And they still, a lot of the anger that we see today is affecting by this legacy. The febrile atmosphere that we see today is absolutely informed by past events such as those.
What can President Macron do to quell this problem?
Well, there are the short-term and the long-term solutions, like in all problems. And at the moment, President Macron sees these riots as very much a law and order problem. He's already sent out 45,000 extra police. He's even resorting to drone technology, helicopters, armed vehicles. He's disrupting social media networks, his intelligence forces, of course. The idea is to prevent people from gathering and basically getting out and coordinating action to cause a lot of damage. But one has to bear in mind that the police that Macron is sending out, they are not just beat policemen. They are highly trained riot officers wearing body armor and carrying an assortment of weapons ranging from machine guns to baton and tear gas. It has to be noted that tear gas is a chemical weapon that is banned in war zones by all international treaties, but it is used indiscriminately against civilian populations in France. So these are not the kind of community police personnel that you might think should become involved in a crisis like this. And what I certainly noticed is when these extremely intimidating paramilitaries turn up and then they start hitting everybody while gassing them effectively, the situation gets far, far worse. So the great balancing act which the French authorities have to play here is effectively between conceding that an agent of the state, a serving police officer, has killed a very young French citizen, while also having to show faith in their police forces. And it has been argued that the reactionary strategy of the Emmanuel Macron administration is in fact exacerbating the problems. But I think in the long term, there has to be some reform within the police. Yesterday only, the United Nations has expressed huge concern at institutional racism within the French police. France's own anti-discrimination body has a number of times found that if you are from a black or an Arab background, you are 20 times more likely to be stopped and searched. So in the long term, there has to be policies that bring ethnic minorities who are currently stuck on those green housing estates, to bring them back into the mainstream society and give them the opportunities they deserve, like the rest of the French population, and being treated equally. And effectively, France has to live up to its own Republican ideals and apply liberty, equality, fraternity to all of its citizens.
Nabila Ramdani, we've got to leave it there, but really good to see you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.